in the early years, I really tried hard to hide the disability, even though obviously I wasn't successful. But there was that part of me that wanted to hide it. I didn't want people to see if I was in pain or suffering or if I had a need. And so I would struggle unnecessarily. And now I'm really into the idea of interdependence and realizing that we need each other and it's okay.
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abby, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Richard Propes as we take a communication perspective on his event, the Tenderness Tour. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Richard Propes. Richard is a man of many talents. He currently serves as the Director of Provider Services for the Bureau of Disabilities Services for the state of Indiana. He's the founder of the independentcritic.com, where he reviews feature films, short films, and books. He's the founder of Race Away from Domestic Violence, a 5K event in Indianapolis, raising money for the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. He's the author of The Hallelujah Life and the founder of the Tenderness Tour, which is what we're going to talk about mostly today, but we'll touch on a little bit of all of it. To tell you a little more about the Tenderness Tour, it began in 1989 when Richard left downtown Indianapolis in his wheelchair with $20 in his pocket, a backpack on his wheelchair, and a handful of press releases announcing his Tenderness Tour. On this first tour, he traveled via wheelchair for 41 days, over 1,000 miles alone around Indiana. Now, 35 years later, he's traveled over 6,000 miles by wheelchair and raised over $1 million for charitable organizations worldwide. Having beaten cancer twice in the past year, Richard just completed his most recent Tenderness Tour, a 160-mile wheelchair ride in September 2024 that raised $115,000, which was able to eliminate nearly $17 million in medical debt for people in Indiana. Okay, that was a lot. And, I usually don't do too much of an introduction, so keep in mind that that was the pared down version, just so you know how much there really is to say about Richard, and you can read more about him in the show notes. And of course, you're about to hear from the man himself. So just let it tell you how much we have to talk about with Richard today. What I want to offer you going into this is to hear this conversation as an invitation into a kind of radical acceptance. We don't use that language in this conversation, but I think that's what it is that Richard offers us here. With that in mind, I know I've made you wait long enough. Let's begin the conversation with Richard. Hello, Richard. Welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told. Thanks for joining me for this episode.
Absolutely. My privilege. Thank you.
I'm really honored to get to speak with you today. And before we get into introductions, which does feel like the first part of a podcast, I want to back up a little bit and start our time together by asking the question, how are you arriving? And to me, this is about context. So important to say that as we meet each other, we are bringing with us our days or our weeks or some larger context that are with us. So I wonder if I could pose that question to you right now, and I'll share too. How are we arriving right now?
I am arriving with, first of all, a lot of excitement. I love the idea of real conversations. Showing up as I really am excites me, and people who seem to be open to that. It has certainly been a busy day. I work for the government and we have a new administration here in Indiana. So I am dealing with that in my professional life. And that brings with it a lot of stress and anxiety. But as we'll go into, this conversation is exciting for me because it really comes out of first off, the fullness of my life, but also a project that I started last year that has become so integral to who I am. And so I'm really excited about that.
Wonderful. Well, yes, I'm arriving with similar excitement and curiosity. It's the evening when we're recording. I don't do most of my recordings in the evening. So my energy, I've been thinking about that today of wanting to kind of conserve so that I could arrive to our evening recording with energy. I'm thinking that this conversation, which I'm again really excited for, is going to be a little different because like you and I have already discussed, some of my other conversations, there's like a specific area of expertise or a field that someone works in. And so there's kind of like one specific topic area, and we use a communication perspective to think about the stories and the meaning making that goes on in that one specific area. But you've got a lot of areas of your life that are all a very important interwoven part of this story of yours. And so I'm just excited to learn more about your perspective. I'm bringing the communication perspective. I'm really excited to hear about the Richard perspective, whatever you would describe that as. So thank you for indulging me in that. With that aside, I would now love to invite you to introduce yourself. I really like to be intentional around this because I know I could read a little bio about you, but I want to know if you're thinking specifically about this conversation we're about to have, what is relevant? What do you want us to know about you in the context of this conversation?
Well, of course, the basic. I am Richard Probst. I am a nearly 60-year-old adult with spina bifida, which in itself is exciting to me because it was wholly unexpected.
Yeah.
I was originally given 3 days to live. And so every day past that has just felt like incredible. I'm a survivor of sexual assault and sexual abuse, and that really feeds a lot of my activism. I started this event and I called it the Tenderness Tour because I wanted to experience that. I wanted to see if that existed in the world. And so I went out in a very grassroots way to find it. And when I found it, I knew that I had kind of the obligation to spend the rest of my life sharing it.
Hmm.
And so, and really honestly finding it in different ways. And so I am a person of faith. That's integral to who I am. And I'm a writer. I am a film journalist. I work for the government. I never thought I would spend my career working in the field of disability, but I found that I'm good at it. And I think that not only do we need to have folks with disabilities in the workforce, but we need to have them in leadership with
Mm-hmm.
voices and not just sitting at the table, but at the head of the table. And so I'm excited to be in a position that allows me to do that. So I kind of do have all of these roles. I'm a film critic, and really I am just somebody who thinks that every single moment is an opportunity to give and receive love.
Hmm.
That's kind of the essence of who I am. And so I look for that regardless of what my life experience is. And sometimes that comes out as writing, sometimes that comes out as activism, sometimes that comes out in writing a state policy. And it's who I am. And it's like with the Tenderness Tour, my goal, I tell people the best way to live life is 2 to 3 miles an hour. And that's
Mm.
about my speed when I'm on the road.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
it's exciting. And so that's really kind of the essence of who I am. I am someone who is trying to live into that word tenderness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a perfect place to start. And now, can you tell us more about the Tenderness Tour, what it is, and how it came to be?
Uh, Absolutely. I started the Tenderness Tour on October 8th, 1989. I was at this point in my life where I felt like I had lost everything a person can lose. I had lost my wife to suicide. I had lost our newborn child. I had lost both of my feet. I had lost everything financially because I went into this downward spiral. And to be honest with you, I was kind of in this suicidal phase of my life and really struggling to find a reason to go on. And yet I had this really dramatic suicide attempt that failed miserably. And so I kind of came out of that saying, okay, I need to figure out why I'm here. And so I came up with the idea of this Tenderness tour. And to be honest with you, the name, I don't know how familiar you are with the 80s music, but there was a band called General Public,
Okay.
and they had this song called Tenderness. And I
Mm.
loved this song. And the video involves children, and it had just an innocence to it that I wasn't familiar with.
Mm.
And I just thought there was something about that. And it made me think of the word tenderness. And so I started planning this idea that I would wheel for 41 days and 1,000 miles around the border of Indiana as a fundraiser for what is now called Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, and just talk about my story. And I really wanted to see if there were good people in the world. There was part of me that thought I would come back from that tour and I would fail and I would find out that, people really do suck. And I would just probably come back and try to kill myself again. But just the opposite happened. I left Indy with $20 in my pocket, a backpack on the wheelchair, press releases that were written on a typewriter. That's how long ago it was.
Uh,
And I had no clue what I was doing. I mean, I had mapped it out beautifully. I had never done anything like that before. I was a out of shape wheelchair user who had just lost two limbs, and yet there was a part of me that just needed to do something that extreme. And then I just started wheeling. And I mean, it kind of blew myself away that very first night, because that very first night, I had ambitiously thought that I would wheel to Shelbyville, Indiana. I didn't come close to Shelbyville, Indiana, but I did make it to Greenfield. And, I was greeted by the fire chief, and I ended up spending the night in the fire station.
oh.
And it was just amazing. And night after night and day after day, Hoosiers just kept showing up.
Mm.
I never went without a place to stay. I never went without a meal. If I needed physical assistance, I would seemingly magically find people who were really comfortable with disability and really comfortable with assistance. It was just amazing. And I came back from that trip knowing that there were good people in the world and feeling like, okay, this just wasn't a one-time trip. And I've never done 1,000 miles again, and I
Mm-mm.
probably never will. But I knew that once I tapped into that hope and that idea that the cycle could be broken, I came back from that trip and I knew that, first of all, I needed to get my act together. I was living on disability. I was suicidal. I didn't have stable housing. So I came back and I got stable housing. I made a plan to get off of disability. I went back to college. I had kind of failed the first time. I went back to college. I went to Martin University here in Indianapolis and latched on to Father Boniface Harden, who started the university. And he took a really huge interest in me and just really helped me turn my life around. And so the tour really has become an annual event, sometimes small, sometimes, maybe 15, 20 miles. Other times, I've wheeled to Chicago 3 times. I've wheeled to Lexington, Kentucky. I've wheeled to Cincinnati. I've wheeled all over the country.
Wow.
And it's usually violence prevention causes. Of course, we know I've detoured into other causes because anytime I can look at a cycle and say this contributes to people not being able to live their good life, I find that I want to do something about it.
Mm. That's so wonderful to hear all of that story. And the thing that I'm curious to know more about to start with is there's some language within the theory that all of my work is centered around CMM, coordinated management of meaning. And it's saying we're meaning making creatures, we're storytellers, and most importantly, I would say our communication creates our social worlds. And so the ways that we have of being with each other really matters because that's how the quality of our social worlds get created. A couple of really important ideas within this theory is the language that the theory uses, at least, is emergence and mystery. And those have, as a kind of more natural planner, Those have been two ideas that are really become important to me, and I've really had to learn a lot about. So I'm curious to understand more about the role of emergence and mystery in, for example, your very first Tenderness tour. So I want to know more about what were the planned elements of this that went really beautifully, but also what emerged in this.
What really went well was I actually planned the route
Mhm.
beautifully. That first day I was off course, but I actually finished in exactly the number of days that I planned.
Yeah.
So even though I had done the mini marathon once on crutches, but by this time I was a wheelchair user and I had never done anything long distance in a wheelchair. So I had no frame of reference,
Mhm.
but instinctively I seemed to know what I could do. And I think that I had written the right people. So, I had written press releases to city officials, city hall, to local media, to some churches, some nonprofits. And so all of that went pretty well. So even though I left Indianapolis without a lot of connections, I had really reached out in the right ways. I think part of the mystery, of course, was wondering how my body was going to respond to all of this.
Mhm.
How am I going to take care of myself? How am I able to make sure my needs are met? I'm very prone to dehydration, so I had to make sure that I was getting fluids. How am I going to make sure that I not only find housing, but I find accessible housing? And quite frankly, I had no clue what story was going to come out.
Mhm.
Part of the mystery was what story is going to come out of me. I mean, at that point in my life, I had spent probably about 4 or 5 years kind of dabbling with suicide, really started it in high school. I had dealt with sexual abuse. I had, of course, grown up with a disability that had, caused probably about 50 operations at that point. And yet I knew deep down I didn't want to project negativity. I didn't want, and not I want vulnerability, I want honesty.
Mhm.
It was about breaking the cycle. So it was about kind of discovering my story and finding that balance between, speaking my truth and also looking for the light within all of that. And I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't necessarily learn it all right away. I look back at some of the old media articles and interviews, and I'm like, wow, I was really negative, or I sounded really wounded, or
Mhm.
and sometimes I just plain sounded like a victim. And it was a learning curve. And it was also a learning curve learning how to deal with the media, who, can sometimes like to sell the drama.
Yeah,
And
right.
so I got better at that over time. I got better at the self care and really learning how to live into my story differently. So it was definitely, I think that was the big part of the mystery was, can I do this? What's my story? And quite frankly, even wondering, are there good people in the world? I
Yeah.
mean, I genuinely didn't expect to find the kind of reception that I found when I was on the road. And it's not that I'd never encountered good people. I grew up in a hospital with, nurses who refused to give up on me. To this day, I mean, I'll say that I'm alive because nurses loved me to life. But all of that was such a remarkable mystery. And then to come back and to realize that I'd had this complete opposite experience. And what do I do with that?
Mhm.
I mean, it was really kind of traumatic to come back and realize, wow, I've lived all of this trauma, but that's not all there is. Coming back, I really, I wrestled for a while with, okay, what do I do with all this new information that I have no frame of reference for?
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I really appreciate this kind of point that you've ended on here because, again, using the language of CMM and this communication perspective, I talk a lot about stories and specifically changing our stories, and that I want to empower people to be reminded that they get to tell a new story. There's a lot of stories that we internalize. You kind of reference, especially if a person that has a disability or has experienced some of the things that you have, the story is that you are the victim and we should feel pity and you should feel, X, Y, and Z. The stories go on and on and on.
Yeah.
You're saying that you're actively endeavoring to tell a new story and to create a new story for yourself. And what I really appreciate you're highlighting, that I don't think I've really highlighted on this podcast in any of my conversations before, is that is a lot easier said than done. To tell yourself a new story, to do the first, probably, deconstruct that old story and then reconstruct and build a new story for yourself.
I was so lucky because when I came back, and first of all, I encountered Father Hardin, who, again, I don't know if you know Martin University, but it's a primarily Black college here in Indianapolis. And Father Hardin was this older African-American Catholic priest, very into social justice, very into social change, and looked exactly like Frederick Douglass. To the point that he did one-man shows as Frederick Douglass. And he was such a phenomenal human being. And I came back from that first trip and I had this healthy male role model. And that was so essential to getting me on the right track, to getting me started. And, I went from bombing out of my first college, from being a C+ student in high school, barely getting into college, to being valedictorian at Martin University.
Wow.
With a 4.0.
Wow.
And it was really about him helping me. First of all, they figured out how I learned and they adapted my program to that. But they also helped me find my story. And I think that that's a really important piece. He saw the disability. He saw the challenges, which I think is important because I don't like to deny the disability.
Yeah.
But he also saw the fullness of who I am. That just got me on the right track, and it got me into. I came back and I had to undefine what love is. I realized it was all of these abusive things, and I came back and I started thinking, okay, I'm just going to undefine it. I don't know what it is. I'm going to just say start from scratch and try to look for people who I think look like what I want love to be. And I started doing that. And it worked really beautifully, quite frankly.
I feel like I'm going lingo heavy on you, but you're just describing a lot of things that I have language for. The language that's coming to me now is this idea that, we would say that meaning is socially constructed is one way to say it, but people that I work with, they prefer relational construction. It's kind of this idea, again, meaning it's created in relationships. So it makes a lot of sense to me that what you just shared was immediately to start talking about the people in your life that helped you to tell these new stories, because it's created in relationship. And it's kind of, true on both ends, for better or for worse, that your first definitions of love were created in relationships, in abusive relationships, and maybe unhealthy spaces, but still relationally. But also true on this other side of people showing you tenderness, people showing you that love that you were searching for, that relationally constructs this new understanding.
It was, yeah. It was groundbreaking. And I think once I started to tap into that, it's pretty phenomenal to see the changes that started to unfold for me. I had failed my first job, but then I went back to Martin. I got my degree. I became valedictorian. I, did an internship. I was a counseling psych major. I did an internship, got a job literally the day after college, and, worked in crisis intervention for 9 years. So, completely utilizing my own life experiences. And I just watched that change over time. And I watched and experienced all of the changes in my stories, and even my Tenderness tour. After, let's see, my first 6-7 tours, I wheeled alone on the roads. In 1996, I was now working at a hospital in crisis intervention, and 3 nurses said, "We're going to go with you because we think you'll be healthier if
Mm,
you have support." And so that was the first year I wheeled from Indianapolis to Chicago, and I had these 3 nurses with me. And I came back and I was healthy.
mm,
And, just such an affirmation of how that interconnectedness could literally, tangibly make me a healthier human being,
hmm.
which made me more effective as an activist too.
Oh, yeah.
I raised more money. I was healthier. I was cleaner when I did speeches and appearances. And so now every year since, I have a support team that goes with me.
Mm. I do kind of want to pause here and go back. What does tenderness mean to you? How are you defining that?
Whew. I have to start with a joke. Okay.
Okay.
That's who I am. The first year when I was doing the Tenderness tour, one of my friends decided to put a tattoo on me. It was my first tattoo. And she was not a professional artist.
Okay.
And you can tell by looking at that because anyone who has ever looked at it thinks that it says tender mess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've kept it because I think that that was how I started.
Mm,
I started as this tender mess, this guy who had amazing potential to be a really loving, vulnerable human being and who just needed some help to get there and who just needed to realize that a lot of those early tapes, no matter how graphic they were, how violent they were lies. They were not the truth of who I am. And it took me a while to get that. And there are times I still forget. So I think in some ways, I discover a little bit more about tenderness every time I go back out on the road.
hmm.
I figure out what it means for me, which I think involves a combination of showing up fully as who I am, both the adult with a disability who sometimes has remarkable vulnerabilities and needs very fundamental assistance, and also someone who has achieved really remarkable things that most people would love to achieve. And trying to find that balance of being who I am and being able to trust that in whatever relationships I'm in, whether that's, a relationship or friendships or work or peers, my road crew, really just showing up in that. I think that for me, the longer I've wheeled, the more I've realized, and it's a little cliche, but I'll go with it. Vulnerability really is a superpower,
Yeah.
which is the complete opposite of what I was raised with.
Mm,
And yet I was raised in a body that practically demands vulnerability. And I think it's one of the greatest gifts of disability. And I think disability has a load of gifts.
hmm.
I think that growing up in this body that was made for interdependence is a remarkable experience. And I think tenderness for me has been learning to live with that, lean into it, trust it, and really use it as my activism, use it as one of my superpowers. And that still
Yeah.
sounds cliche, but I like it.
I like it. I like it. It sounds like to me you're talking about more like ways of being, like tenderness is a context or a condition or like the space that you create in your ways of being. It's not, oh, well, say this to me and that's tenderness.
Yeah,
It's, show up this way and be this way together relationally, and we'll create the conditions for tenderness so that things like a vulnerability can happen in that space.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's it. And I think that I spent so much of early life in this constant state of crisis and this constant state of instability that really getting back to the core of who I am and the ability to be present is remarkable. I had a great experience once, is a few years ago, where I was sitting in a Walgreens parking lot, kneeling next to my car, getting my wheelchair out of the car, and I hear this woman yell my name which was Ricky when I was a child. She yelled Ricky. So I already know it's somebody who knew me as a child. And I look at her, and this older African American woman who I don't recognize. And after a few moments, she comes up, introduces herself to me, and she literally remembered me from my infancy. She was one of my nurses.
Oh, wow.
She remembered because I was born at Witham Hospital in Lebanon, Indiana, and I was transferred to what was then Marion County General. It's now Eskenazi. And she remembered my arrival. She remembered my parents' names. She said, I always knew you were going to survive. She said,
Oh.
you had a spark
Oh.
and you've still got it. That's how I knew you. She said, your eyes, that's how I knew you.
That's incredible she recognized you.
I was blown away, but she knew too many details. It's like one of those things
Yeah.
where I was like looking around the camera. Okay, is somebody here filming this? But the great thing about it is one of the things that's always challenged me is I've never been able to remember anything before abuse.
Mhm.
Abuse is my first memory.
Yeah.
And that let me know that there was something before.
Mm.
And that it must have been pretty incredible for someone 50 plus years later to recognize me who hadn't seen me since. So I think it really is about, for me, tenderness is about figuring out how I can be who I am and be in relationship with that and be in relationship with others and invite others into that same vulnerability to be safe, to be in relationship, whatever that means.
Yeah. Yeah. What a beautiful story to be given someone telling you I always knew you were going to survive.
Yeah. I mean, my parents were given so many limitations for me. And my parents were 19 and 20 when they got
Oh,
married.
wow. Mhm.
And I was born 9.5 months later.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were poor, they were struggling, and
And so young.
so young. And to be faced with raising a child with a disability who was given so little potential for survival and who was told that he would always be dependent and yet really as dysfunctional as childhood could be in a myriad of ways. I mean, they never held on to that.
Mhm.
My mom once shared a story about the fact that she was Catholic and a Catholic priest came in and delivered last rites at one point and said that it was God's will that I not survive.
Wow.
And she left the Catholic Church over that. Of course, the punchline to that is she became a Jehovah's Witness, but
Okay. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that's okay. But they never, I think that they were almost, I don't know what it was. They never bought into those limitations. And so, and I was born at just the right time. I was born because I'm hydrocephalic. I have water on the brain. And so I was born like 3 or 4 years after the shunt was invented.
Oh,
5 years earlier, I would not have survived.
wow.
I was in the very first class that was mainstreamed after the Rehab Act was passed in 73. So I was one of the test cases for public education for people with disabilities. Just so many amazing things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. On this vein of, changing stories and growth, I would say it sounds like I'm curious to know more about how, you said 1989, this is a long time that the Tenderness tour has been going on. How has it evolved?
I've gotten old, probably more than that. No, of course, I think the first really big evolution was the support team. That was really big. I think that the first few years was all about abuse. And then I
Mm,
started looking at all of the things that contribute to the abusive cycle. And that's
mm,
when I really started to expand kind of my horizons into different areas. I did things with domestic violence. I am the founder of the Race Away from Domestic Violence here in Indianapolis, which is a 5K. And it's now in its, I think, 22nd year. I think my self care has evolved. I think that I certainly have changed my life dramatically. So, that first year really was kind of about abuse because I was on disability. I'd been suicidal. I had a very dramatic story. And over the years, that story has changed dramatically. And so I've become someone who really doesn't like to sell the drama anymore. When the media talks to me, I get a little frustrating for them because, I don't want to go back to what happened 50 years ago.
Yeah, right.
And so, I'm very into where I'm at now and the fact that cycles can be broken and that
Mhm.
you can have a history of the worst relationships in the world, but you can learn differently. And, we can show up for one another and be present and all have different gifts and it can work. And I do like the more I become comfortable. I think in the early years, I really tried hard to hide the disability, even though obviously I wasn't successful. But there was that part of me that wanted to hide it. I didn't want people to see if I was in pain or suffering or if I had a need. And so I would struggle unnecessarily. And now I'm really into the idea of interdependence and
It's
realizing
beautiful.
that
Yeah.
we need each other and it's okay. And I think one of my roles, even in my work life, I think one of my roles is to show that you can be fully disabled, have all of these needs, and also live a really amazing, successful life.
Yeah, that's certainly a story we all need to hear more, and internalize more for ourselves, that interdependence, relying on each other and providing help to each other is a really
Yeah.
beautiful thing, not a negative thing, not a limitation, not a weakness, but a really beautiful thing.
If there's been one evolution of the tour, I think that that's really been it, that I lean into that more. I never thought I would be doing it 35 years later,
Uh-huh.
but, and technically I retired from it on the 30th anniversary,
Uh-huh.
but, you know, I keep finding reasons to go out. And
Mhm.
so I keep going out.
Yeah. I imagine that something that pulls you back is seeing the impact it has on people. So I want to ask in a very specifically, not in a we're here for the drama way. What
Uh-huh.
have you been able to witness as far as what you're sharing your story means to other people?
I think the biggest thing is, I mentioned earlier that I like living at 2 to 3 miles an hour. And, when I'm wheeling at 2 to 3 miles out an hour, whether I'm on a city street or a trail, I, you don't avoid people, you don't get to pick and choose. And so I meet who I meet, whether they are black, white, rich, poor, young, older, Democratic, Republican, independent, whatever they are, I meet them and I have conversations with them. And I I think that I model the kind of world that I want to live in. And I think that that kind of world involves just being able to show up and be who we are and creating a safe space for one another. And and I think that that's a lot of what happens on the road. And I do think that having a disability helps because there are people who look at it and they see the vulnerability and they see my willingness to show up in that, and they don't know what to do with it, and so they have to explore it a little bit more. And so we talk, and and I think what it does is it invites other people to do the exact same thing. And so, on this last tour, which was eliminating medical debt in Indiana, I met so many different people from, going through Hamilton County to spending some time up in Elkhart County in Shipshewana, where there's a high Amish population, and realizing that so many of us, honestly, we just want human connections. We just want something honest. And, you know, even with the idea of medical debt, I went into communities that were hardcore Democrat communities, and I went into communities that were hardcore Republican communities, and we all agreed that we want to take care of one another. That, medical debt shouldn't destroy a family. Now, we may disagree on the solutions, but there's that common ground. And I think one of the gifts of the tour has been that I'm really good at creating a space where we can find that common ground. And when I look back on the 41 days and 1,000 miles, I was so naive to even try that. But man, I can't imagine not having tried that. And I think that in some ways I still possess that quality, which I consider to be almost a childlike faith in people.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope I don't lose that. I'm almost 60 now, so I'm probably not going to lose it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I'm hearing in your story is that you don't shy away from complexity. Does that feel right? Okay. Yeah. I think that that's a skill that we all could stand to have a little more of, part of CMM and focusing on a communication perspective. The word dialogue comes up a lot. And to me, the definition of dialogue is about this tension that we live in. It's holding your ground. It's having confidence and trust in what you know to be true about the world, what your own experiences have been, what your own stories are, and at the same time holding space for other people. And there may be very different stories. And I just think so many people encounter tension and complexity in their lives and take it as a sign, like a stoplight. Feels too scary. It feels too big. It feels, unmanageable. I don't know exactly what, every individual person would call it. But I just think we could all stand to learn the tools to lean into that complexity. And I think storytelling is one of those things that equips us for that. The more stories we hear, the more stories we tell ourselves that are these, more empowering stories. That's when you feel like, okay, this is complex, but I'm not going to try to oversimplify. I'm not going to try to run away from it. I want to try to lean into it and learn from it. What do you think about that?
I think that's really accurate. And I think that if you would see one of my social media bios, one of the phrases that I use to describe myself is story seeker. I'm a very active listener. I love being fully present, and I'm pretty good at doing that without an agenda, without thinking, what am I going to say next? And creating a space for whatever, kind of like this conversation, creating a space where whatever needs to unfold unfolds, but also being intentional about creating that space. And I think that that's been the gift of a lot of my activism. I think it defines the tour. I think even my book, The Hallelujah Life, I think that it defines that book. I think that book, I can't tell you, I mean, it's been out for 10 years and I still get people writing me about it and talking about my willingness to put pretty hardcore truths out there and to create a space where they could acknowledge their own truths. In fact, it's fun. I did this last tour and I struggled a little bit. They're making a documentary about the Tenderness tour, which is very exciting. I'm very pleased with it. I know the filmmaker. I trust her. But man, I hated having a camera on me the whole time. It took away from the intimacy of those encounters. And it was such a struggle because that's such a neat part of the tour for me. And I think it is what draws me back out there so often. I think it's also why I was good in crisis intervention. I mean, talking about kind of the diversity and complexity of my life.
Yeah.
I spent 9 years doing suicide intervention, and I was found to be very good at dealing with people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. And the biggest gift that I had there was the willingness to just be there and to listen. And if they talked 2 words a minute, I didn't go away. And some do talk 2 words a minute, but they talk. It's kind of like, people who want to say someone's nonverbal. That doesn't mean they're not communicating. They're communicating. We just have to slow down and listen. So, I mean, professionally, I did that, and that led to the job that I have now. And I do think, again, I almost feel like I'm all over the place, but it's like having a disability just lets you lean into that. I mean, when you have a body where sometimes, you know, you need physical help, or sometimes, I have an ostomy since I had cancer last year, and sometimes I have to deal with the ostomy in my work setting. I'm not hesitant to say, hey, pouch popped, I gotta go. So not your typical work conversation, but essential. And I just think disability really is the greatest gift in the world. I mean, yes, it's got its challenges, it's got its negatives, but my word, I mean, my life is amazing. And disability is a key part of that because it creates this environment that is just tailor made for fostering relationships and connection and interdependence and intimacy, which is a word that still kind of scares the crap out of me, but it does. And the healthier I've gotten, the more I've really leaned into all of that. And it's made the tour better. It's made my writing better. It's made me better at what I do professionally. And I think it's made most of my friendships and relationships and all of those things so much better and so much healthier.
Yeah. So many thoughts going through my head right now. You said a lot of really wonderful things, and I do want to try to collect them all in some way. And that's to say, I want to turn the conversation towards your kind of meaning making process. We've already talked about the stories you're telling
Mhm.
and moving, from older to new stories, creating new stories in your life. But I'm curious to know more about how you've made meaning out of the things you experience. You referenced earlier, giving and receiving love being
Mhm.
a kind of lens, maybe you would say. And so I'm curious to know in your own words what's been the processes, or, I jokingly referred to, I've got the communication perspective, you've got the Richard perspective. What's the Richard perspective? How would you put that into words?
I think it would be a core piece of I'll go to my faith. A core piece of my personal theology is this unrelenting belief that we're all made in the image of God, zero exceptions. And so when I look at my life, my challenge is to see God in all of it, whether I'm losing a limb, whether I'm dealing with cancer, whether I am, dealing with a body fluid that decides to go completely bonkers, which happens way more than I'd like to admit. My vision, my theology is that every expression of who we are is an image of God. And so I think that just for me calls me into doing something with that. That calls me into, first of all, healing myself and treating myself better. But it also calls me into seeing that in everyone that I encounter. That's not always easy. I'll be the first to admit that. I'm human. I, you know, somebody parks in the blue striped spots next to the accessible parking.
Hmm.
I'm not always thinking nice things, but I work very hard to see that image of God. And I think that fuels my activism. We talk about meaning making. I think that if you genuinely see, or if I genuinely see, I'll own it. If I genuinely see and believe that every human being is made in the image of God, then I have a responsibility to treat them like that. There can't be an exception. There can't be Richard saying, oh, well, that person created their life circumstances, so I'm not going to help them.
Hmm.
They're made in the image of God. I'm going to help them. If that means I have to give up part of my resources so they have enough, I'm going to do that. And I do that probably to an absurd degree, but it's what I believe in. And I think that the evolution of my meaning making has been going from doing activism out of my victimization into my survivor into my thriver, again, probably using cliche, but really watching how I evolve and making sure my activism follows that. So, it couldn't be about, oh, Richard's going to heal now, and then he's going to become wealthy and, screw the rest of you. No, it's hopefully just the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
The more successful I become, the more I want other people to succeed. And that's very much what happened with the eliminating medical debt. I went through a year-long battle with bladder cancer that ended up being also prostate cancer. And yet, for the first time in my life, I was not worried about losing everything.
Mm.
I had insurance. I had enough of an income that I knew I could pay my out-of-pocket expenses. And so I didn't have that stress. And I came away from that, 6 surgeries later in 1 year, realizing I want everyone to have that. I mean, it's ridiculous that you can go through cancer and lose everything.
Yeah.
And so that for me is kind of the not only my meaning making, but the evolution of my meaning making, I think.
Yes.
Hope
Yeah.
that answers your question. Yeah.
It does. And it's got me thinking one of the kind of fundamentals of CMM is you get what you make. And that is so evident to me in your story of in the seeking out of tenderness, you make the conditions for tenderness. In this, you say to the absurd degree that you are loving people in the world, seeing people in God's image. You're creating, like you're making that. You get what you make. I can't say it, better than that. And you touched on it, which I'm grateful for. That this idea that communication is so much more than the words we say, and it is it's not. If we're talking about turning untold stories into told stories, it's not just hey, you share your story. We have to be thoughtful about the conditions, the kind of space that we're creating for people to share those stories into. Because like we started this conversation with, context is so important. And so I think it's really important that we're thinking about all of these different things. And as we're kind of wrapping up here, I like to transition into using this language that comes from the CMM theory of better social worlds. That's the goal of everything within CMM. We're creating better social worlds. And I won't have us get too much into it because I actually want to leave this as kind of the reflection question for people listening. I like to say that, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. So there's, a lot more to come after this. You're still doing incredible work in the world. The documentary will be coming out. There's a lot more conversation to be had. So I do want to kind of leave it with people to reflect for themselves of how this work that you're doing is part of creating better social worlds. But I do want to offer one answer from myself, and I'd love to hear what you have to say before we wrap up too. It's coming to me, this language of what should be versus what is, or what we think should be. And that is such a barrier to real connection and vulnerability and tenderness, I think, is when we focus on what a story should be, what we think it should be, rather than letting a story be what it is. I see that in a lot of what you said today. I see that in the book that you've written, that you reference, that people, I think that's probably the gift that you're giving people in that book, why people still write to you, is because you're not acting like your story is something it's not. You're just saying, this is what my story is. And that, again, you get what you make. That allows other people to do the same for themselves. So I want to throw that out to you, see how that feels, and ask you, what's the better social world in all this?
I really resonate with everything you said. And as you were talking, the feeling was so much of my life is about, it's kind of like that journey of undefining love and moving into something else. And taking that journey of being willing to kind of play with that and to really figure it out and to experience it. And I see that I've done that very much with that basic definition of love, but also with the idea of disability. For me, it's about honoring all of the challenges of disability. They're very real, and I don't ever want to disown them. And it's, even when I was going through cancer, I wanted to share everything honestly, but also celebrating all of the gifts, the complete fullness of who I am, and raising the expectations for me of what that disability word means and what it means to live it as not just a diagnosis, but a social construct,
Yes.
a cultural construct. So that's what I would offer.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, I love it. I think we're hopefully really leaving people with this imperative to lean into the complexity and learn how to do that. Look for the tenderness, create the love, and let your stories be what they are. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. And it is not over just because the episode is, but I really appreciate your time and your perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been a joy.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.